It's great to be here. Thank you to ESMT and Forum New Economy to invite me. And the audience might be surprised, why am I even speaking on this topic? Because as they said, I'm a professor of finance, and often finance is the enemy of responsibility and purpose, often thinking, well, this is a waste of money, companies should all be about profit. But hopefully what I'll try and present in the next half hour is the importance of responsibility, not just the social and the moral and the ethical case, those are really important, but also to stress there's also a business and financial case. And I think that second stress is really important, because if it was only the ethical case, it may well be that in the mind of a CEO or a CFO, this is something that should play second fiddle towards profits, but it can be that in some cases, not all, but in some cases, both profits and purpose can be intertwined. And I think a good way to start is to give an example of what I mean by a purposeful business. And in fact, my view might be somewhat different to what we typically hear. So to do this, let me go with an example. Let me just take you on a little bit of a journey away from your home offices to halfway around the world. So I'm going to take you to the Great Rift Valley. Now this stretches across 2 continents and 6,000 kilometers from Lebanon in Asia to Mozambique in Africa. And it has some of the world's highest mountains like this one, but also some of the world's deepest lakes. And one of these lakes is a lake called Lake Magadi, which is in the Kenyan stretch of the Great Rift Valley. Now you might think it's hard to imagine that you're here because you haven't seen it before, but maybe you have seen it before, not on the small screen of your home laptop, but maybe on the big screen of a movie theatre. It was featured in The Constant Gardener, which came out about 15 years ago, was a blockbuster thriller. And indeed, millions of people around the world have seen this lake because they've seen this movie. But fewer than 1,000 people call the lake their home. And one of these people is a gentleman called Emmanuel Saronga, who makes a living selling and herding goats. Now, for Emmanuel, it used to be that cash was king. So when he sold a goat, he would receive cash, but he'd then have to check that cash in case it was forged. He'd have to store that cash and worry about it being stolen. And then to bank that cash, it wasn't just walking down to the high street. He had to walk for an entire day to get to the nearest bank. So his life was really tough. He couldn't just graze his goats in the greenest pastures. He always had to be within 1 day of the bank. But all of this changed due to what I would view as a purposeful business. And this purposeful business was Vodafone, the UK telecoms giant. Why? Because Vodafone in 2007 launched M-Pesa, which is a mobile money service. So let me explain briefly what mobile money is, because some people think it's mobile banking, right? I have a bank account and I can operate it on my phone. I don't need to go down to the branch. But actually with mobile money, you don't even need a bank account to begin with. And that's really powerful because back then, 15 million Kenyans had no access to the banking system. So mobile money allowed you to transfer money from phone to phone, just like people used to be transferring mobile minutes. So this completely transformed Emmanuel's life, right? He no longer needs to deal with robbery or forgery. He doesn't need to deal with cash. He can graze his goats where he wants to, and he's got a record of every single transaction on his phone. But as academics like Rajshri and Jörg and I know, you can't just extrapolate from one single anecdote. Indeed, there was a study by MIT economics professor Tavneet Suri and her colleague William Jack, which found that within the first 7 years of the launch of M-Pesa, 200,000 Kenyan households got lifted out of poverty. And many of these households were headed up by women. It allowed them to move from agriculture to business and retail. So there was a big effect on gender parity as well. So that's one story I'm going to give you about Vodafone. But I'm now going to give you a quite separate story. And this separate story surrounds tax. So in 2012, Vodafone became the first telecoms company around the world to release a tax transparency report showing how much tax they were paying to governments around the world. And that's really important because in telecoms, you could choose to locate your licenses in low tax jurisdictions. So I've got 2 questions here for everybody to think about. So the first is, which of these decisions, launching M-Pesa or tax transparency created most value for society? The second is which of these decisions, if it had not been taken, would have led to the most public anger or worsened Vodafone's ESG rating or reputation? I'm not going to poll anybody because most people agree with the answer. So which decision created most value for society? It was the first one. Right, by launching M-Pesa, Vodafone lifted 200,000 households out of poverty and contributed to gender parity. But let me now turn to the second question. What would have the outrage been if Vodafone had not launched M-Pesa? It would have been nothing, right? You don't get slammed by the media for not launching an innovation. There would have been no customer boycott if Vodafone had not come up with this crazy idea of banking without a bank, because nobody would have ever thought it was possible to begin with. But what is the consequence from not being transparent about tax? It could be massive. And indeed, Vodafone themselves had suffered a nationwide boycott of its stores 2 years previously. So this is why my view of purpose might differ slightly from many people's view. So often we think about purpose and responsibility as being about the answer to that second question. Purposeful businesses should do no harm. They should not cheat on taxes. They should not pollute the environment. They should not mistreat their workers. And please don't get me wrong, absolutely that is a critical part of responsible business, doing no harm. But I would say in 2021, it's not enough for a business just to do no harm. It must actively do good and answer the first question. And why is that? There's two reasons. There's first, the moral and ethical reason, which is that in 2021, given the scale of the world's challenges, be it climate change or biodiversity loss or automation or inequality, it's not enough for a company just to do no harm. It must actively do good. But the second reason is the financial and business case. And that I'll illustrate with some diagrams from the book that Thomas kindly referred to. So we often think that the value that a company creates is given by a pie. And that pie can be split to investors in the form of profits, or society in the form of wages to workers, taxes to government, or fair prices to customers. And often we think that responsibility and purpose is about splitting the pie more fairly. Let's sacrifice profits to serve society. Maybe we're going to give some more money to charity or pay higher wages than we can get away with. And again, please don't get me wrong, fairness and equality is a critical part of responsibility. But I think that responsibility must be more than that. Why? Because there's at least two limitations with viewing responsibility as being just about redistribution. The first is that, well, many CEOs might not want to do it, right? If indeed it makes their company less profitable by being purposeful, then many CEOs will practice purpose to the minimum possible. And indeed, we saw 2 years ago, almost to this day, right, the company's 181 CEOs in the US signed the Business Roundtable statement claiming they're going to be serving wider society. But when the rubber hit the road, many of them did not put it into practice. And you might think, well, why would they? Well, if purpose means less profit, let me not do it. Second reason why purpose must be more than just being about splitting the pie is that it's bad for investors. Now, many people think, well, I don't care. We like to see investors as nameless, faceless capitalists. Investors are them, society is us, and if we can take from them and give to us, then that's going to make everybody better off. But investors are not them. They are us, but they include parents saving for their children's education, pension funds saving for retirement, and insurance companies funding future claims. So any repurposing of business absolutely needs to take investors seriously. Profits play a key role in a well-functioning economy. So this is why my view of purpose is that it's about growing the pie. Right, we do want to increase the orange. We absolutely do want to create more value for society. But the way we do that is not by giving them a greater slice of what's already there, but through innovation, through excellence, through coming up with some crazy ideas like banking without a bank. And the beauty of this is that ultimately investors will be better off. Because back then, right, Vodafone's strategy was not to expand into Kenya. Its strategy was to expand in the West and to win spectrum license auctions. But it just chose to launch M-Pesa because it wanted to use its technology to enhance socio-economic progress. And as a byproduct, investors became better off because they were able to monetize it. I think this point is really important. So some of you might have seen Tariq Fancy, the ex-sustainability chief of BlackRock, with his recent critique of sustainable investing, saying that if sustainability does lead to profit, well, why wouldn't people pursue it anyway? Why do you need an ESG lens if this is something which is going to be profitable? But here's the key crux, is that profit is only a byproduct. It's not necessarily something that you can maximize objectively or instrumentally. Right, so we know as finance and economics professors that one way to take an investment decision is net present value. Right, before we take an investment, we can calculate how many toys the factory will produce, how much we can sell the toys for, and therefore how much money we'll make, and we will compare that to the cost. Now that works in a world of certainty, but in a world with a lot of uncertainty, it's really hard to do that net present value calculation. Right? Could Vodafone back then have predicted the net present value to investing in M-Pesa? It would be really difficult. Right? Most likely it would have failed. Right? Would it be go through regulatory compliance? Would it work? Would there be a problem with money laundering? And even if it succeeded, the people who it would serve were some of the poorest people in the world, so would they be able to pay for it? So this is what I think the power of purpose is that it opens our eyes to opportunities to create value for society that might ultimately become profitable, but we could have never predicted the profits from the outset. And that's related to another point. So often people think, well, when I speak about growing the pie, I'm about growing profit and making as much money as possible. That is not the case. The pie here is not profit, right? The pie is social value. So let's think about how companies can create more social value. Profit is one byproduct of that. And through creating social value, can companies become profitable in the long term? Now, at this point in my talk, maybe 12 minutes in, you might think, well, everything I said sounds great, but where is the evidence, right? It seems a bit like wishful thinking. If companies just serve society, magically will they become more profitable? So this is the role of academic research, which is why it's great to partner with the ESMT on this. Right, and with academic research, it's important for us to focus on the most rigorous evidence. Why? Because of this concern of confirmation bias, which is people have their views on ESG, and they're likely to latch on to anything which supports their preconceived view. So even if there was a very flimsy paper claiming that ESG pays off, people might latch onto it uncritically because it confirms what they would like to be true. That's the problem of confirmation bias. And a couple of years ago, I gave a TED talk on this called What to Trust in the Post-Truth World, about how critical and how discerning we need to be with evidence, particularly if it's on a topic that we feel strongly about. And this has indeed played out recently. So I don't know what your LinkedIn feeds were looking like in around February, but mine went crazy because of this new study, which apparently came out showing that ESG always pays off. Right, so here was a leading investor in the UK saying, is there anyone left on the planet who thinks that sustainability sacrifices return? Right, you have to be an alien not to think that. And then people fell over themselves to agree with him. Right, it's really broad, thorough, infallible facts and robust proof. And then a few months later, there was a study which showed the opposite, coming out of EDEC in France, claiming there was no evidence that ESG outperformed. And again, that led to people on the other extreme saying, yeah, ESG is a complete waste of time. It's just a ruse. There is no alpha. But then I wrote to the Financial Times with my own view on this, which is, well, views swing from one extreme to the other. But to avoid this black and white thinking, let's pay attention to studies based on their scientific rigor, rather than whether they support our views on ESG. So we look at a study by the rigor of the methodology, not on whether we like the findings. So this is something that I wanted to do myself about 15 years ago when I first got interested in the topic. So what I wanted to look at was, does purpose actually pay off? Do companies that serve society actually do better in the long term? Now the key challenge here is, well, how do you measure purpose, right? You could look at a company's purpose statements, but maybe the statements sound great, but they don't actually do anything. So another approach might be to look at companies, do they put their money where their mouth is? How much do they donate to charity? How much do they spend on their workers? However, the problem with that is that measures the input, how much they spend, not the output, how effective they are. So anybody who's a fan of a sports team will know that some football teams can spend loads of money on players, but not actually deliver the results. And then more seriously, on the flip side, maybe there's some great things that companies can do to serve society, which don't really cost them a lot. Right? To be a great boss, to be a mentor to your subordinates, to give them meaningful work and skills development, to allow them to present at meetings, that's not something that costs you money, but it does make a big difference. So what I wanted to do was to look at an output measure of how much you actually serve stakeholders, rather than an input measure, how much you spend. Now, what I wanted to look at was employees. Now, there are obviously other elements of society like the environment and customers. I'm going to get to them later, but I chose to focus on employees because I had a very good measure available, which was the 100 best companies to work for in America. So this list was really nice because it started in 1984, so I had tons of data. But because ESG is a pretty new phenomenon, many ESG factors have only been, many data sets, have only been around for the last 10 years. And if I showed you that ESG paid off from 2010 to 2019, you might think, well, those were 10 boom years for the economy. Maybe ESG only pays off in a boom time. Maybe right now in the pandemic, companies should just focus on profits. So because my data started in 1984, it has things like the financial crisis, like September the 11th and the collapse of the internet bubble, so I could make sure that the outperformance was robust. Now, obviously, one huge challenge here is correlation versus causation. Is it that employee well-being causes companies to perform better? Or once a company is already performing well, then it can start thinking about employee well-being. So I have to do a lot of tests in the paper to try to suggest that it's the former, not the latter, but I won't bore you with all of that because I want to get to the bottom line. And so what the bottom line was that I found that the 100 best companies to work for in America delivered shareholder returns that beat their peers by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period, which is 89 to 184% cumulative. So simply put, companies that were treating their workers well were being moral, and they're being ethical, and they're being humane, but more than that, they're actually being more successful in the long term and delivering higher shareholder returns. So the final section is on, well, how do we actually then put this into practice? So let's say we do want to be a responsible company, right? Well, how does that actually affect the decisions that we make? And I think it's important here just to go back over the word purpose, which has been a subtext to my talk, but I haven't really defined it. So many people view purpose as being a synonym for altruism. So they might think that as a purposeful company, we need to serve all 17 sustainable development goals. You might have a purpose as the following: it's to serve customers, workers, suppliers, the environment, communities, and investors. Now that sounds fantastic, right? We're serving everybody, but it's unrealistic because there are trade-offs, right? So even if we ignore profits and only think about society, there will be trade-offs between different stakeholders. For example, if you are a energy company and you close down a polluting plant, that's good for the environment, but it's bad for workers. So if you say your purpose is to serve everybody, then it's not going to guide you in how to actually make decisions. So, well, how do I define purpose? Well, it's not actually about altruism. It's about being focused and targeted. So let's think about the word purpose. A purposeful meeting is one with a clear agenda. And if I do something on purpose, I'm doing it deliberately. So this is why I define purpose as why a company exists, who it serves, its reason for being, and the role that it plays in the world. Now that might sound pretty lofty and idealistic, but it does highlight the importance of being targeted. So why do you exist? For example, with Vodafone, their purpose is to use technology to enhance socio-economic progress. That's why they chose to launch M-Pesa. There was nothing in that purpose statement about climate change, right? Launching M-Pesa will have had some carbon impact, but because their key expertise was technology, that's why they thought that that was a personal decision. It's a bit like as a person, your purpose would not be to be a professor and a doctor and a lawyer and an entrepreneur. You might just be one of those things because it's important to focus. So let me just briefly pick this apart. Right, why do you exist? What I highlight in the book is the importance of comparative advantage. So it doesn't mean that to be a purposeful company, you need to be all things to all people. You need to respond to every single ESG issue that happens to be in the news, but just to focus on the ones that you are uniquely well placed to solve. So for example, when there is an issue, let's say diversity, which is clearly something that I care about, like, is it indeed best for you to immediately give lots of money to charity? Well, maybe not, because your expertise as a company is not choosing which charitable causes are most worthy, diversity versus the environment versus healthcare versus children or something, but to use your expertise in technology. And that's why I think the use of the launch of M-Pesa was a great use of comparative advantage when maybe charitable donations are not. And the who is, who do you want to serve? Like, there's so many stakeholder constituencies out there. Which are the ones that you will consider first among equals? And this is linked to the principle of materiality. So what do I mean by materiality? So this says that out of all of the different stakeholders out there, some of them are more important for your business model than others. So let's think about the first column, which is mining, extractives and minerals processing. What this chart from the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board materiality map shows is that the environment is really important. Like, if you are Rio Tinto and you blow up Juukan Gorge, that's going to be really bad for you. But if you're in the financial sector, well, maybe at least the environment directly is not so important to you. What is maybe more important are things like selling practices and product labeling. We don't want to be in a Wells Fargo fake bank account company. And so what that means is, yes, we all care about climate change, but maybe if you're a bank, the best way that you can serve society is to be right at the top of your game on things like selling practices. And so that is linked to the final study that I'm going to show you, which is one in a top accounting journal, which takes the ESG data from MSCI, and it looks at companies that do well across the board. They do well across all sustainability dimensions. Here, notice I'm broadening it out from employees to other stakeholders. Now, what they find is that companies that lead on sustainability overall, they actually don't beat the market. They only beat the market by 1.5% per year, which is insignificant. And notice this goes against the standard story that ESG always outperforms. But then when they redid the study with a materiality lens, and they looked at companies that did well on the material issues, but actually scaled back on the immaterial ones, they did beat the market by 4.8% per year. And it's worth pausing to highlight the power of this result. So what this suggests is that it's actually better for a company to do well on only a few things than to do well on everything. Because if you're doing well on everything, right, maybe you're spread too thinly, you don't have a priority structure, it's actually best for you to focus on the specific issues that you think to be most important. And so that goes to my final section, which is, well, how did this pan out in the crisis, before I hand over to Rajshri for her comments. So I wrote the book before the pandemic, and there was a lot of concern when we went into the crisis that responsibility would be a thing of the past because people just didn't have the money to practice responsibility. But indeed, we saw some fantastic responses from some companies. So some companies did what I call pie splitting. They gave up parts of the pie to help others. So some CEOs sacrificed their salary. Other companies continued to pay their workers even when they were furloughed. And some companies gave stuff to customers. For example, Unilever gave out 100 million euros of food and sanitizer. Now, those are fantastic examples, but the problem with viewing responsibility as being about splitting the pie is many companies did not have pie to split in the pandemic. Why? Because they were really strapped for cash. So this is why I think it's so powerful to view responsibility as being about growing the pie, and this links to the opening example of Vodafone. So what a responsible leader, I think, asks herself is, what is in my hand? Like, what are the resources and what is the expertise that I have, and how can I redeploy this to serve society and solve the social problems of today? And the beauty of this is that this need not involve spending a huge amount of money, and that's why this was feasible in the crisis. So you could have companies in completely unrelated industries helping out. Yeah, it's easy with Unilever being in food and sanitizer to help out, but what if you are Mercedes, right? Your main job is to make Formula One engines, and that's not really helpful. But what was in their hand was precision engineering expertise, and the same precision engineering that you need to make a Formula One engine, they redeployed to make CPAP breathing machines, which is a less invasive alternative to ventilators, and mass produce them at scale. Or maybe if you were a perfume company, what was in your hand was the ability to make alcohol-based products, and you pivoted that in order to make sanitizer. Now, the nice power of this is something that even small companies can play a part in. Right? If responsibility is about giving massive charitable donations, then that rules out small companies which are still struggling to survive. But if purpose involves redeploying what's in your hand to serve society, maybe a small company can play its part. So let me just end with an example of a small company that I'm a customer of. So this is a company called Barry's Bootcamp. It's a brutal chain of gyms in London and throughout the world. So people like David Beckham go to this place. Now, they were obviously shut during the pandemic because of the lockdown. But what was in their hand was fitness expertise, and they used this to offer free fitness classes through Instagram to people self-isolating at home. Now, you might think, well, that's not that great an example, right? A fitness company offering fitness classes, albeit online. But here was the great thing. Right? What if you are a receptionist at that gym? Right, the gym is closed, so what can you do? Well, what it turns out is that many of these receptionists were actors as their main job. But if you're an actor, obviously your income is pretty volatile, so they took this desk job at the gym to provide them with income stability. Now, if you're an actor, what is in your hand is that you're really funny. Well, how does that help out? Well, in the pandemic, we had a lot of schools shut, and therefore children were at home. And so what they offered were things like Zoom storytelling sessions to take the load off working parents when they had business meetings. Now, that might only be a small thing, but I think it highlights the power of thinking creatively about using your expertise to solve social problems. So obviously the pandemic has been really devastating, but if there's a small silver lining to it, it highlights the power of purpose, not just being about using money and investing cash, which not all companies can do, but thinking creatively about how can we redeploy the resources, expertise at our disposal to address some social issues. So thank you so much again to ESMT and to Forum New Economy for the invitation, and to everybody for attending. Really look forward to the comments that Rajshri has.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
much.
Sorry.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. This gives us such a broad area of discussing various aspects that are of extremely high relevance from such a different number of perspectives. I look very much forward to the discussion. As Thomas had already said, there will be first a moderated discussion by myself between Rajshri and Alex. And then obviously we also would like to invite the audience to share their questions in due time. Maybe Rajshri, sorry to have interrupted you, but from your expertise, for example, in development economics, what is your take on the book and also the main narrative that Alex presented?
Great, thank you very much. I mean, first of all, Alex, congratulations on the book. It's fantastic. For those of you that haven't, that don't yet own a copy, it's won pretty much every award out there. So if you haven't got a copy already, you should go out and buy a copy. It's great. I love the examples, and personally, I really liked the book for three main reasons. One is that the message that purpose and profit are not a zero-sum game is a fundamentally optimistic message. And that's something that I think we can all use right now is some optimism. But at the same time, you're not blinded by optimism in the sense that you look at this message. You obviously, I'm guessing you're personally attracted to the message, but you put on your skeptical researcher glasses and look for rigorous evidence, which we can all really appreciate, because you don't want to just drink the Kool-Aid because it's attractive. The second reason I like the book is that as an economist, the idea of growing the pie is something that, is actually very firmly grounded in economic theory, right? It's central to the idea of economic efficiency. And I think to bring that message from sort of micro theory to a broader audience is incredibly useful. The third reason I really like the book is, and you didn't talk about this quite as much in your presentation, but the message comes across very clearly in the book, is that your emphasis on moving companies' narrative away from avoiding errors of commission, this do no harm mentality, to avoiding errors of omission, meaning taking opportunities to grow the pie by actively doing good, represents what I think is a really badly needed paradigm shift in business. And I think you're absolutely right to say that it resonates with a new generation of consumers and workers. So, my broad thoughts on the book, why I think it's fantastic. In answer to your opening question, Jörg, I find all of this personally very, very compelling, but it's so compelling that I find myself asking why more companies aren't doing this. If it's so obvious, I know you talk about some of the barriers to this being done, but really because the arguments are so compelling, I do ask myself why that's happening. And concretely, I think, and you to discuss this at much more length in the book, that there are a few reasons for this. One, as you correctly mentioned, I think, is the idea of managerial incentives, which some of my research focuses on as well, in that at the end of the day, managers are compensated on the basis of their share of the pie, which is often, paid to them in terms of short-term gains rather than this long-term growing the pie type outlooks. There's managerial incentives. I think there's also this managerial mindset, and let me just maybe mention a few recent examples that sort of speak to this, which is that I think managers continue to view this in many cases as a zero-sum game. And the example that springs to mind is really the last year when workers in Alabama tried to unionize. Now, if I put on my spectacles using your book, I'd say to myself, okay, that sounds like this may be an opportunity to grow the pie. But of course, this was fought tooth and nail by Amazon until in the end, these workers weren't unionized, which then also raises the related question that speaks again to what Jörg was asking, what role governments have to play in terms of offering supportive institutions for growing the pie, given the managers view there being this trade-off. Now, the third point, which is actually very closely related to development economics, is that, perhaps there are, in most cases, and you don't make a claim that in all cases there's no trade-off between purpose and profits, but I'm wondering whether there isn't more often than not a real trade-off between purpose and profits, in the sense that, suppose that part of a purpose-driven company is offering decent wages to your workers, many of whom, certainly in the manufacturing sector, are located in developing countries. Well, that translates into higher prices for your consumers, and consumers at the end of the day may be making their purchasing decisions on the basis of price rather than purpose. And alternatively, if I need to have investments in order to tackle climate change, then that's going to translate as well into higher costs, higher prices for my consumers. And this again hurts profitability, which means that there maybe is a more fundamental trade-off between purpose and profitability. And my final thought that speaks to the current crisis, especially as it relates to the developing world, is when it comes to COVID vaccines. So you have the two main producers at the moment, AstraZeneca and BioNTech Pfizer, where AstraZeneca was very explicit from the very beginning that it was going to be purpose-driven here, that it was going to price at cost and not to make a massive profit. And Pfizer and BioNTech haven't had the same strategy, if you like, with the consequence, by the way, that the vast majority of the world, talking about growing the pie and serving society, remains unvaccinated, especially those in developing countries. And AstraZeneca, this in principle incredibly purpose-driven company, has been seriously dinged in the process. And so this sort of speaks to the risks involved in the errors of commission and the errors of omission. So that's a long list of sort of thoughts from that, but perhaps you can speak to some of them, or maybe Jörg has some more concrete questions.
Yeah, indeed, I have more, but no, thank you, Rajshri, for these great points. Alex, would you like to take a couple of them first?
Well, actually, I won't respond to them because I think they're all very good points. I think they're all really good reasons as to why this might not be put into practice. In fact, I will just add an additional reason rather than rebutting any of Rajshri's reasons. So why might it not be put into practice? I think another reason might be the distortion of incentives in the other way. So Rajshri correctly highlighted that maybe you have incentives for short-term profit. And so even though the pie grows from investments like situation that you discussed, it only grows in the long term. But on the flip side, it might be that some leaders have incentives to do ESG, even if it is not linked to profit. So what I highlighted in the book and the talk is that only ESG dimensions on material issues ultimately improve profits. But if you are a business leader who wants to be seen as the savior of capitalism, then maybe you will pursue purpose willy-nilly. Maybe you will do things like donate lots of money to charity and so forth. So you can get into situations like Emmanuel Faber of Danone. I know that this is a controversial situation. Different people might disagree on it, but there is certainly a camp where people were concerned that he was more concerned with himself seeming the savior of capitalism and becoming the first person to be an entreprise à mission, rather than actually creating long-term value. And so sometimes you might have an agency problem where you're pursuing too much ESG rather than too little, and that could also lead to ESG being done in a rather indiscriminate way.
So thank you very much, Alex. So you just saw to the audience Molly's suggestion that if you have any questions, or when you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A. We'll obviously take them into account. I'd like now to use, so to say, the monopoly of being able to ask a question, which relates also to this recent crisis. There is long-term evidence that actually has been used by Franklin Allen, another very prolific finance researcher, who said the following. When you look at the reaction different countries have to a crisis, then you see that managers have different preferences in how to react to these crises. And the reactions in particular are different between the US, the UK on the one hand, and say Germany and continental Europe on the other hand, while managers tend to prefer to cut employment in the UK and the US and keep dividends constant. Rather, what you see in Europe, in Germany in particular, is to keep, in Japan even more so, you see managers have a preference for keeping keeping employment constant and cutting dividends. Now, this is probably more, you could say, a certain preference that you could see in certain economies. Alex, how would you relate this to the purpose that you think of? So basically, this preference for, you could say, keeping dividends versus employment constant.
Yeah, so I think that they just have a different way of viewing labour. So in Germany in particular, you have labour representation on the board. And so that means that in a downturn, you will be preserving employment. Now, you might think, well, is that just not clearly better and more consistent with the pie-going mentality? But there is a cost for that, is that is providing insurance to employees. And actually, what's found is that you might reduce their wages in return for that insurance. So what I'm going to put into chat, in case it's of interest, is a paper which was published as the lead article in the Review of Finance. It's an academic journal, which looks at the effect of labour representation in governance as an insurance mechanism. And their identification was really clever. So in Germany, I believe it's at 2,000 employees, that's the cutoff, where it determines whether your board has to be 1/2 employees or 1/3. And they do what's called a regression discontinuity. They compare companies just below the cutoff to just above. That's a shock which causes you to have more worker representation. And what they did find is that, yes, you get some more insurance in a downturn in response to crises, but there is some cost to that. So I think this is interesting because it shows that some of them are, one mode is not better than the other, it's different. And one might think that the flip side of not being able to get rid of workers in a downturn is maybe if things are going well, you might not be willing to hire workers because you think, well, you don't have the flexibility to get rid of them. So I think those are both reasonable business models, but they are ones where they might just differ in terms of the environment and the institutional context that we're in. So often we like to say another country has this particular mode and that mode is clearly better because that country is more productive, but it could be that that high productivity is due to many other things, or maybe the particular way that they have of managing workers is something which is just culturally quite different. So like in Germany, I believe it's quite common to rent houses rather than buy houses, but the rights that you have as a renter are much stronger than you are in the UK. So generally in the UK, you typically see things as more flexible than you might then in Germany, even though that flexibility might come at a cost of long-term relationships.
Thank you. And indeed, when you look at, say, also the development of labor markets, unemployment rates, and so this is exactly what you see, that on the one hand, obviously, once a crisis starts, it's flatter in Germany than it is, for example, in the United States. But you would also obviously see the opposite once the economy recovers again. And so therefore, the question of what is, so to say, economically more efficient is open. But it's a very interesting part that relates to this. I would like to go back to Rajshri's point, the question of why don't we or haven't we seen more convergence between purpose and profit? And Rajshri, I would like in particular to go back to your earlier study on incentives in tea making. Could you relate a little bit to this and maybe what could be the implications of this for, say, maybe the broader business community?
Okay, so in terms of it's a very different type of situation. I was looking at the effect of monetary incentives with using tea pluckers in India. Is, Alex, you and Jörg certainly know it's often difficult in work settings to measure productivity. And the reason tea pluckers is attractive is that you have an objective measure of productivity. So it was a situation in which you had an incentive change, and the incentive change was one in which you had a higher base wage and flatter incentive pay. And any sort of normal economic theory would suggest that you should have lower productivity as a result, because you're just getting money whether or not you work. And if you work, you're getting less money on the margin because you have a flatter incentive structure. And what we find in that study is that contrary to what the standard models say, if you look at the short run period, you see that there is a dramatic increase in productivity that you can't wish away using whatever method, whatever quasi-experimental method you want. So that would suggest that there's something behavioral going on, which speaks then in some way, not directly, but somewhat indirectly, to some of the things that you talk or imply in your work, Alex, to the extent that, profits alone are not enough. There's an idea of purpose beyond that. And in this case, the purpose may come from social relationships between an employer and an employee that results in, say, this reciprocity, you're treating me well, and so I'm going to work harder as a result for you. So in the short run, you see an increase in productivity that is completely surprising, that we can only explain by some kind of behavioral model. What exactly the behavior is that's driving this, we don't know, but it's behavioral. But what is interesting is that in the longer run, so 4 months out, beyond 4 months, they basically settle back down to what a standard model would have predicted in terms of output. And what that suggests, sort of going back to what some of your ideas are in your book, Alex, is that, in a lot of the types of relationships one has with, a firm and a customer or a worker and their employer, and this is, I guess, a question, sort of passing on Jörg's question to me, to you in terms of your work. I wonder what the baseline of interaction is. So if I'm a worker with my employer, some workers no doubt want to work for a purpose-driven company, but I imagine for other workers, it's just a job that pays the rent. And I want to be able to have a comfortable job and get paid, the most that I can get paid in that job. So I'm wondering to what extent necessarily do you have like some idea of to what extent jobs are, or workers are purpose-driven in their jobs, or care about their companies or employers being purpose-driven, as opposed to just this being a monetary exchange between an employer and an employee?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and this is one where I think evidence can be quite misconstrued or misportrayed. So often people think, well, particularly with millennials are all about purpose, and so companies need to be purposeful to attract the top talent of our respective universities. But in fact, the same studies that show that millennials want to be purposeful, they also find that the same people want their companies to be effective. So it's not that you can be purposeful at the expense of profits and success. So I think what this means in terms of should companies be purposeful is I think it is fair for companies to offer a different sort of set of possibilities. So there might be companies which offer lower wages and purpose, and other companies which are all about efficiency, and then they might just pay the higher wages to employees as a result of the higher profits. And I think we should be allowed to have different types of companies. Obviously, they all need to obey laws and business ethics. But there is this view that we should have this one-size-fits-all idea of purpose. There are some investors who are trying to portray themselves as a bit like a government to try to push out some particular ESG practices among all companies. But I think that we do want heterogeneity and diversity among companies. So there are some employees who might think, well, purpose is a luxury. I want to put food on the table and send my kids to school. And I think that's something which is a very purposeful objective. So even though I am an advocate of ESG, does this mean that every single company needs to prioritize it? Not necessarily. All I would like is that companies to be clear about what they are doing. So what is not good is greenwashing, where companies claim that they'll be really purposeful, but not actually put this into practice. But I do think it is fair for some companies to focus on providing a healthy and adequate standard of living for their employees, and the others to say, no, we're actually going to compensate you in non-pecuniary ways.
If I can ask a quick follow-up question then, can you speak a little bit to which kind of companies should be, purpose versus profit-driven? I mean, some can be both, but you said that there can be this, I'll call it a separating equilibrium, with some companies following one strategy, others following others. Do you have like a typology then, or pre-criteria to follow one path versus another?
Not really, because I think even in the same, so like the easy answer to that would be about industry. So if it's industries in which human capital is more important, then you might be more purpose driven. In particular, when discretionary effort is more important, that's something which is difficult to measure with piece related pay and so on. So you need to motivate them with purpose. But actually what is interesting is you do find some separating equilibrium or heterogeneity even within the same industry. So let me use a potentially controversial example. So Uber, I know a lot of people say Uber is a really bad company because they don't provide worker rights, they have 0 hours contracts. But when the novelty's worn off now, I don't do it anymore, but when I first started taking an Uber, I would speak to the Uber driver and ask him or her why did they choose to work for Uber. And many of them said they used to work for Addison Lee or other chauffeur companies, and they just wanted the freedom. So what to some people would be inflexibility and insecurity, to others was a freedom and the possibility of being your own boss. So within the same industry, so let's say providing chauffeur services, you can have some companies which would be maybe the more purposeful angle in that you're providing more secure employment and healthcare benefits. And then another type of employer which might be seen as less purposeful because you're not providing that, but actually with that lack of security gives you have the flexibility, and you're going to have different types of people working for Uber, maybe students or people who are self-employed who want to have the ability to scale up their income when they need to, who are going to that. So I think even with the same industry, you can have some heterogeneity.
Perfect. I'd like to pick up one point you mentioned before, and also now the question of greenwashing. I mean, we now see a lot of debate, also news about the question of to what extent does ESG investing really have an impact? So, and investors may also get, in particular, maybe retail investors may get also concerned about the real impact their investments may have. So how much do they really help to green the economy, be it in sovereign bonds, as we now see sovereigns to issue green bonds, so-called green bonds, in particular, but in particular when you look at corporates. So what would be your advice? And let's say follow up on what Rajshri said before. What I like very much about the book, also the presentation, is this evidence-based optimism that you share, that you inspire the reader with. What would be your basically advice on this side? So basically this ESG compatible, or say ESG enforcing investment that could be taken.
Yeah, this is interesting. It's another nuanced issue. So the answer is it depends, which is always the economist's answer, but let me explain what it depends on. So there's two main channels in which people argue that ESG investing has an impact. And what do you mean by having an impact? Is changing the companies that you're investing in, not just giving higher returns. And one of them is the idea of capital allocation. So the idea here is that, well, if you boycott from fossil fuel companies, you deprive them of money. And if you invest that money into clean energy, then you're giving them some more money. But in fact, this is much more difficult and much less powerful than one might think, right? Because in order to sell from a fossil fuel company, you cannot sell without somebody else buying. So you're not actually depriving that company of capital. And this is really important because people think about boycotting fossil fuels like customers boycotting. Like customers boycotting is really powerful. If the three of us was to walk away from a company that just doesn't treat its workers well, nobody might come into the place since it's just lost that revenue. But if all three of us sell fossil fuel companies, somebody else needs to buy. Now, you might think, well, if we're selling, then yeah, somebody else buys, but we're driving down the stock price. And therefore, if the company needs to raise more money in the future, its cost of capital is higher. But the problem is these fossil fuel companies, they're not really raising a lot of capital because they're cash rich and investment poor. And going to the evidence, there's a paper from about 20 years ago by Ivo Welsh and co-authors, which looks at the effect of the South Africa divestment campaign to try to end apartheid. And that was a really powerful campaign that a lot of people were involved in, but what they found was the effect was minimal in terms of causing change. I wish it was higher, but that's sadly what the evidence suggests. But so that's the bleak side, purely allocating capital. It's not clear that that's something which can cause impact. But the second is engagement, which is once you have stakes within a company, can you actually try to change how that company is run? So one recent example, as we'll all know, is engine number one. this small investor, which has a stake in Exxon and was able to get 3 climate concerned directors elected to the board. And there is evidence that general engagement by investors will indeed create not just shareholder value, but also social value. So this is in chapter 6 of the book, is that if the engagement is undertaken by investors with a lot of skin in the game, which can deeply understand the company, understand what ESG materials are ESG issues are material and which are not, then that engagement does typically have impact in terms of creating social as well as financial value. The flip side is that we now see these gadfly investors, and these gadfly investors are small investors with little skin in the game. They might have an axe to grind, a particular ESG issue that's their hot button, and they try to impose this across a lot of companies. And there's a recent paper by Nick Ganchev and Maria Gianetti, which finds that those gadfly investors, when they come in and try to engage in activism, that actually subtracts value. So what it requires is a deep understanding of the company and skin in the game, rather than you just having your bee in the bonnet and trying to impose your preferences across every company, regardless of materiality.
So I'd like to follow up on this. So when we think of, say, the development of capital markets or investing behaviors over the last 20 to 30 years, we see this significant rise of passive investors, ETFs, and so on. So what you just described is that those who could really make a difference might rather be, say, activist investors, those who really have the skin in the game to see this. So could the ESG investing therefore lead to, you could say, of a reactivation of active investors? Could this be one consequence potentially?
I think so, yeah. So in general, but there's 2 main types of activism. One of them I'll call generalized activism, which is something that you don't really need to understand the company in detail to do. It's something where you can be one size fits all. So in general, longer term incentives are a positive thing, as Raji and I have suggested. But there's other types of engagement, which I call specialized engagement, where you actually do need to understand the company's business model in order to try to propose some changes. So this suggests that index funds, what they can engage in generalized things, and indeed there's some work by Apple, Gormley and Kime finding that generalized engagement by index funds does work. But for ES particular, not the G, but the E and S, that is particularly specialized because you do need to understand business models. That is where I do think activist investors and active funds do have particular comparative advantage given their deep understanding of companies. And this is interesting, sorry to lengthen my response, but we often band ESG together, right? But they're actually quite different because G, like good governance principles, greater board independence, reduction of overboarding, those are things that are quite general, and the evidence does find that that is generally good. But E and S, that does tend to be a bit more company specific. And so we need to realize that actually we shouldn't lump these all together necessarily when we're thinking about activism and engagement.
I'd like to use the opportunity to actually include the first question from the audience, which I find is a very interesting one. So the question from the audience, and I'm basically just reading it, is that, so it's basically about the comparison between politics and business. So basically the person who asked the question says, in the context of politics in the United States, for example, partisan arguments are influential regardless of rationality. And the question is, could the same problem apply to decision makers in business? So in that sense, could business leaders also be more committed to promoting their own biases rather than fighting the uphill battle of rational decision making? So to what extent could this be the case?
Yeah, so I'll start and then love to hear Raji's views on this. So absolutely, I think there's just biases everywhere, and politicians, in business people, in academics as well. And so why might this exist in ESG? You have the incentive to make very sweeping and strong claims. So what we've discussed today is, well, actually it's quite nuanced. Some ESG dimensions do well and some don't. Now, we're to put this on Twitter, we're not going to get loads of likes and retweets because it's shades of grey. If we were to have a blunt view, which is ESG always pays off, or ESG never pays off, that will get a large amount of say. And often if you're a business leader, what you want to do is have a lot of impact. So if you are somebody who's a big ESG proponent, let's say Larry Fink, you're going to make strong claims as to what you think ESG will do, and then you'll get a lot of publicity from that. And then if you are a skeptic, let's say Tarek Fancy, he wrote an article claiming ESG is complete ruse. Now, some of his claims are actually quite valid, but he's been really sweeping in them and said every single aspect of ESG is bad. And he's got what he hoped for, which was a lot of publicity to it. So I think what we need is sort of business leaders to be much more nuanced about this, but they're not going to do it by themselves. They respond to incentives. So I think the power is actually in us. Right? And what are we choosing to like and read and share whenever you see something which seems to be either black or white, when the real world, very few things are unambiguous. I would rather listen and read an article which is not actually so clear cut and clickbait, even though my temptation might be to click on a one-sided article.
Raji, would you like to add to this?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I completely agree with everything Alex just said. Let me just add to that maybe a couple of thoughts. One is that it's not entirely clear to me that, business leaders' reluctance to embrace ESG is necessarily a sign of irrationality. I think that often, given current incentive structures, it's completely rational for them to proceed along this path. I think that, something that Alex tries to do in his book is suggest that there are actually payoffs that exist in following another path, that I think is very, very useful. But I think part of the issue here, in terms of following this very doctrinal, profit-based approach that we see in most, I'm going to go out on a limb and say in most of business today, really comes from the fact that the incentive structures are such that you're not necessarily compensated if you follow an ESG oriented path. And there I'd add to, what Jörg and Alex were just talking about in terms of activism, either general or shareholder activism. I'd add to that perhaps government support in terms of, regulations and standards that allow for moving from what is, I think most of us would agree, a bad equilibrium in which we are not taking enough care of the environment, we're not paying workers, a lot of workers, too many workers, well enough, to a better equilibrium. The question is, how do you get from this crappy equilibrium that we're in into this, which is often perfectly rational decision from an individual perspective, to this better equilibrium? And I think part of the answer lies in activism, and another part of the answer lies in government regulation. So, it needs to be costly for us to continue to ignore climate change and continue with carbon emissions as things go. No individual firm necessarily has the incentive to do this, because there's sometimes a real trade-off between that and profits. But if everyone is forced to do it, then we can all be pushed to a better equilibrium, and competition won't be able to erode those societal benefits.
Maybe Alex, sorry, please.
No. Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, I really agree with this important point about regulation. I think this is key. So while most of my talk has been about how it's in your interest as companies and investors to think about responsibility, I still acknowledge markets fail, right? So sometimes it actually isn't the case that serving society improves long-term profits because of this problem of externalities. So externalities are when you have an impact in society, where even in the long term, it doesn't bounce back and hit you. And Raji just highlighted the key example of this, which is carbon emissions, right? So if there was a fair carbon tax, a carbon price, that will be something which would indeed internalize the externality and mean that it is indeed in your interest to cut your carbon footprint, because it will ultimately affect your profits. So while I do think, yes, a large role is to be played by companies and investors and citizens themselves, regulators also need to play a huge part. And some concern that people have with, say, the Business Roundtable making these great statements about how we are now caring about society, is people are concerned that that was an attempt to stave off regulation by claiming we're doing it ourselves anyway. But I think we need both companies to be enlightened, but also the governments to take greater action on this.
Thank you. Now we have more questions. Again, very insightful questions. And the first one relates to differentiating even more between purpose and profit, or purpose and results. And there's an interesting aspect here, which I'd like to start with, is the question regarding the uncertainty, or let's say the empirical measurability of purpose versus profits. So, I mean, I think we probably all agree that profits, if you take the big accounting scandals away, are rather easy to measure. How about purpose? Is it more difficult? Is there more uncertainty? Could we even be basically brought to a wrong track or wrong interpretation?
Yeah, so I think this is a really important point. So certainly purpose is difficult to measure, right? It's difficult to measure ex post. So if you want to evaluate which are the companies in the DAX, which are the most profitable, you can just compare their profits, and you can't do that with purpose. But I think ex ante is different. So ex ante is before I make a decision, do I know whether that decision is going to be improving profits or improving purpose? I actually think it's going to be the former. Right, it's easy to, the latter. I think it's easier to see whether a decision will improve purpose than profits. So if you go back to something like Vodafone launching M-Pesa, you have no idea how that's going to pan out in terms of profits, but you do know that that's going to be helping wider society. Many other purposeful decisions, let's say giving your employees more parental leave or giving them meaningful work and skills development, you can actually see how they will in the future affect purpose. So this is why I think managing a company according to purpose is actually easier than managing a company according to profits, because certainly ex ante, it's really difficult to anticipate how certain decisions you will take will affect your long-term profitability. Just like in your job, right? You can think about, if I'm going to do this, right, am I going to be paid more money? For us as academics, right, why do we choose to do a good job in terms of discussions and peer reviewing of journals? It's probably not that we think, if I do this, then I might get a great reputation, then I'm going to get a possibility of an offer elsewhere from another university, and that's going to improve my salary. It's probably more that, no, I view my job as being a citizen of the profession, and my job is the creation and dissemination of knowledge. I'm just going to do this because this is part of my duty as a professor. Now, maybe those who do that, ultimately as a byproduct, will indeed do better and get some nice job offers, but that's very different to the instrumental motivation, which I said at the start.
Rajshri, would you like to add to this, or?
Just very briefly, which is to say that I love the idea that purpose should be at the core of what you do, which is something Alex emphasizes again and again, and then profits is in some ways a side product of purpose, if you have that kind of vision of the world. And the reason I say that is that, I have 2 kids, and that's how I'd like to raise my kids, and if you think this is how I'd like to raise my kids, and why shouldn't that be true of other aspects of our lives, including business? So I really like that. I really like this question in that it raises a question of uncertainty, and all of that's directed to, uncertainty between profits and purpose. I completely agree with Alex's point, which is that there's arguably more uncertainty associated with profits rather than purpose if you have a very clear purpose in mind. The one thing I'd add to that is that I'm not sure that it's uncertainty per se that make people hesitant to embrace a purpose-driven agenda so much as it is ambiguity aversion. So it's not so much risk aversion, but ambiguity aversion, meaning because this is sort of a relatively novel way of thinking in a business sense, you're not even sure what type of uncertainty you're dealing with in the context of how this translates into profit. So I think, one of the things that may be holding people back in terms of embracing this purpose-driven strategy is ambiguity aversion rather than risk aversion.
Perfect. We have another question, which I think I like again very much. It's a question of overperformance or outperformance that we see for different ESG types of investments. And the question here is whether the outperformance is different or maybe stronger in some fields than in others. So for example, does the S generate, say, higher alpha than the E? Any thoughts from your side on this, Alex? And I have a personal follow-up question to this right after.
Yeah, so when I started writing my paper on employee well-being, I did this cross-sectional analysis. It didn't make it into the published version of the paper just because of space limits. But what I looked at was, is this matter more in what I thought would be high human capital intensive industries? So something like pharmaceuticals and software, and maybe it wouldn't matter in low human capital industries. And I didn't actually find that. So what I found that it mattered in both types of industries, which was surprising to me. But in fact, when the very first working paper version of my paper came out, the first company to contact me was McDonald's. So you might think, well, if there's any company that doesn't really need to treat its employees well, it's McDonald's, because their labor has got quite high turnover. It's sort of maybe some casual employees who are doing this as a job while at school. But they said, no, we realize that employees are the front line of our company, right? So if they are surly towards our customers, then we're not going to have much customer. So I think this highlights employees as just being a material factor for nearly every industry. I think when you think about the other matters, so like the environment, which the question asked is writing about, that is when materiality comes in. So it will matter in the energy sector or in the mining sector more than, say, tech, or maybe in the clothing sector where labour relations are more important. So I'd say materiality of that topic to the industry is what then becomes important.
Thank you. I have basically a follow-up question on this in the following sense. I mean, we obviously can see exposed what is outperforming or underperforming, but it might be quite different from, say, the expectation we have ex ante, simply not knowing whether certain trends, certain events completely change the path. So this means, let's say ex ante, if we think of 50% probability of raining or sunshine, then it might be unclear whether we should get, say, a bath suit or, say, an umbrella. While exposed, once we've seen whether it has rained or the sunshine took place, it would be quite different. I mean, how to deal with this part in this debate?
So what people typically did with materiality is just to think about just business judgment. So here, what do we think are the most material issues within our company? So a lot of companies within their annual reports will have a materiality map where they will just look forward-looking as to what we think are the important issues going forward. And so this does require a lot of business judgment. I know that we as economists and finance professors like the idea of data, which is really important, but data is, as you're suggesting, backward-looking. What we need to do is combine that with business judgment, which is more forward-looking. There are some more data sets which are trying to be a bit more dynamic. So Arabesque provides more ESG data. They've called their product S-ray. The analogy is X-ray, but S stands for sustainability. So really looking deeply into a company. And what they've done is machine learning and artificial intelligence in order to have dynamic materiality. So it adjusts it much more frequently over time to address some of the issues that you've discussed. But I think what we want to just think about is there will always be some aspect of business judgment there in terms of what will be the important material issues going forward might be different to the ones that we've seen in the past.
Thank you. I have one more question myself, which goes back again to a statement you made or description you made about the Business Roundtable statement some time ago, about the fact that, say, a more, let's say, put it briefly, a more stakeholder-oriented approach should be taken. And then you rightly said that, I mean, this is also what I think Lucian Babchuk provided evidence on, that it was not really put into practice, at least if you look at the bylaws or the constitutional charters of the companies. What do you think? Why? I mean, why is this? Why is there, in that sense, not more, yeah, you could say, action following the announcement of this?
Yeah, this is a really interesting topic. So people thought, okay, there was this big statement signed. Has there been anything actually done? And so Lucian's argument is there hasn't. In fact, I was asked by ProMarket, which is Chicago Booth's blog, to write something. I had actually the opposite conclusion. I'm sharing it here on chat, which I think there was a lot done, but a lot of what was done might not necessarily be the correct thing. So you have now a lot of people trying to jump on the bandwagon and practice ESG. That might be companies giving a lot to charity, even if they don't have a comparative advantage in choosing which cause is the most worthy. You have a lot of investors who are saying we're going to completely avoid fossil fuel companies thinking they're going to deprive them of capital. You have a lot of engagement, but that engagement can be gadfly activism, which is not actually going to create value. So how do I then reach a different conclusion from Bebchuk? Because I'm not sure that the changes that Bebchuk looked for were actually necessary changes to put in stakeholder capitalism. So what he said is it's still the case that CEOs are tied to shareholder returns. But in fact, what chapter 5 of the book suggests is that, well, it's not bad to tie CEO pay to shareholder returns as long as it's long term. So that's the horizon that Raj's highlighted throughout this discussion. As long as it's long term, well, a CEO who knows that she's paid according to long-term performance will take these ESG issues into account. In chapter 5, I go through a paper where it studies the causal effect of putting in long-term shareholder incentives, and that actually improves ESG as well. And also changes in share and governance guidelines away from shareholders. I don't think these things are necessary, because as long as we define it as long-term shareholder value, then ESG can be actually consistent with that. So while I have a lot of time for Lucian Bebchuk and a lot of respect for his work, I'm not actually sure that the changes that he looked for were changes that you need to do in order to practice ESG. And so that's what I put in my article.
So I see there was one more, I think, willingness to ask a question by Alex. Alex, would you like to raise your question?
I think he's had his hand up for the entire time through.
Okay, so then
so it might be that he was always wanting to ask a question and not going to judge, but it might just be that it was accidentally triggered at the start and
okay, very good. Okay, all fine. Raji, maybe also from your perspective, I mean, given basically the importance or the prominence of this Business Roundtable statement, the declaration that was there, maybe also a little bit the strong prominence it has attracted in countries that maybe traditionally had been more, say, known as stakeholder-oriented economies. What is your view about this development?
If you don't mind, I'm going to punt on that question because I don't know enough about the Business Roundtable, but maybe Alex has some views on other parts of the world that have paid more attention to the Business Roundtable.
So could you just repeat the question, Jörg? I have to admit that when you directed it to Raj, I took a little bit of a mental
right. No,
mental
absolutely.
So.
I mean, we know traditionally that there are some economies that are known, more well known for stakeholder-oriented approaches than others. And so in that sense, let's say in continental Europe, the declaration of the Business Roundtable was received with a lot of attention, with a lot of prominence, given that people may have thought, okay, look, now also the US system tries to embody also certain elements that have been known for a longer period of time also in continental Europe. And how would you view this international component of it? So maybe relating it to Raji's question, also how does it relate maybe to other parts of the world in which this may have an impact?
Yes, I'm not sure the Business Roundtable statement would have had much of an impact, because I think in the other countries which do care about stakeholders anyway, they were doing it anyway. So I think maybe they thought, okay, yeah, this vindicated us because like even the US is now taking society seriously. But I think it's difficult to say whether that had any effect on them. I think they were already moving towards greater sustainability. I think what is interesting is how emerging countries are now viewing it. So in particular in Asia, so China historically might have viewed ESG issues as being relatively unimportant. There's still a huge way for them to go, but I do think they are now trying to take this seriously. I think part of it is just to attract international capital. So one of my other jobs is on the Responsible Investment Committee for Royal London, which has 6 sustainable funds. We're a global investor, and certainly to see which companies we're going to invest in globally, we all take these factors into account. So we do see this promulgation of the importance of ESG. Partly it's due to the business case, as I've discussed in my talk, but partly it is due to some investors caring about things other than just financial returns, because if you're a pension fund, maybe you also want to ensure that your planet is not 2 degrees warmer when your retirees end up retiring. And so I think for both of these reasons, we do see a promulgation of the importance of ESG, but I think it's for those reasons rather than a direct consequence of the Business Roundtable statement that we see this popularity.
Good. So unfortunately, I have to say, we are already coming to the close of our very lively, inspiring sessions with lots of new insights. But maybe if we take a little bit of look a little bit into the future, what is it going to nail down? What is also your hope for the developments when it comes to profit and purpose? Raji, maybe in a nutshell, what would you hope for?
In a nutshell, because we're running out of time, I have to say that this last crisis that we've gone through, the current pandemic, it's not even the last crisis, the current pandemic, has led me personally to seriously question, and this comes as a shock to me, the capitalist structure that we've built. I think we need to seriously reevaluate values and institutions that have built this structure. And so it really speaks to, I think, the idea of thinking about ESG systematically, thinking about purpose, why the institutions that we've built are there, and also going back to the fundamentals in terms of economics, in terms of understanding where markets fail and what the limits of markets are in terms of both externalities and market power. And once we then take what Alex has written, thinking about a purpose-driven company, and acknowledge that markets are not perfect, then we see, I think, a better marriage between traditional company goals in terms of profits and the environment and society at large. So my wish is that we transition from very, very market-oriented system to one that is more inclusive.
Thank you. Now, Alex, basically the last statement should go to you. What do you wish for? What do you hope for?
Thanks, Jörg. I just wish for a greater role of academic evidence and research in this. So what we've seen is a great appetite for ESG, which is really great, is that a lot of people now are excited about it. But I think sometimes this could have got a bit ahead of itself. People get excited without having the research behind it. And it has led to some talking head professors and authors and gurus and so on jumping on the bandwagon of ESG and starting to proclaim lots of stuff. And if you say something which is really one-sided, which is ESG is a complete ruse or ESG always pays off, you're going to get a lot of attention. So hopefully what we will get in the future is that this appetite will then be will be married with use of science and evidence, and to look at what the research actually says. And a lot of the solutions that we'll see will be more shades of grey rather than something black and white. It shouldn't be that a company should view it as having responsibility to ticking all 17 sustainable development goals. Let's just focus on a couple and do those really well. And so it's great to partner with an academic institution to do this event, to just highlight the role of research in this question.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I mean, these are, I think, very first of all, thought-provoking, but also at the same time optimistic statements at the end, which also in particular will resonate, of course, well with people in academia, because they have a very important role to play here. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Raji, for being a great discussant. Thank you in particular very much, Alex, for not only writing the book, but also sharing and discussing it with us. It's been a very insightful and hopefully also impactful discussion that we've had to hear. Thank you very much again to Thomas for jointly organizing the event. Now, may I hand over to Julia for the final words? Or Thomas, are you taking over?
We can both. I just wanted to thank you, Jörg, and both speakers. I think it's extremely inspiring. We're on our side working much more on the macroeconomic side, and this is really, really interesting to see how the ends fit, and that there's something common growing, and maybe something which we don't yet realize, because with paradigm shifts very often it's ex post afterwards that people realize that there has been a paradigm shift, and not so much in the daily business. And maybe at some point people will say that Alex and Raji, you have contributed massively to this paradigm shift. I would wish for that because I'm very inspired by what you're saying. And we will continue to work on that. We have another workshop, a big main workshop end of October, where we want to have a panel discussing purpose and bringing together different actors of paradigm shifts. So thanks very much for you both and Jörg, and yeah, hope to see you soon and maybe in person at some point in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.